Hi, my name's Michael, and if you're watching this, that means there's 4 days until one of the biggest days of my entire life. I should have made this video a long time ago, so I'm going to have to tell you a lot of information in a very short time. I was raised in the foster care system in Alaska, and I was separated from my parents when I was 3, and then I was reunited with them when I was 4. While I was in foster care, my mom had struggled with drug dependency, and my dad had struggled with just a divorce and just overall abuse. So some of that got put on me, which is why I got put into the foster care system. So just to catch you up on why I'm doing this project, when I was in Austin, Texas 3 years ago, I knew that I had biological family in the area, but being adopted, I wasn't very keen on actually tracking them down or like having a conversation because they weren't there for me like going through my actual life. So I really didn't feel like it was necessary to keep them involved in my life as an adult. But upon like further reflection, I figured it was just kind of it was pretty selfish of me just to turn away a biological family just because of the past. And that's when I decided to make this project. I had reached out to my biological mother when I turned 18, and she was able to meet me at a conference in Georgia. And at that time, we had been separated for 12 years, and I wanted to see her after all that time, and I set my expectations really high and went over and met her. And I wanted to, before I met her, I was like, she's had 12 years to get her life together. This is going to be somebody that's has a nice car, has a great job, and is just overall taking care of themselves. And then as soon as I met up with her, those definitely weren't the circumstances, and I had set my expectations way too high. And then based off of that interaction alone, then I just kind of silenced everything from the time I turned 18. I mean, I was just out of high school and I was poised to go to college, and I just wanted to be normal because being in the foster care system and being adopted by a great family, I just didn't want there to be any friction on like why I'm not succeeding, why I'm not able to move forward. So if that meant cutting out a relationship with a biological parent that was never there, then that's what I was prepared to do. So I went completely silent for 10 years. And it wasn't until I was in Texas that I kind of checked myself, and I realized that that was a really selfish way to live, of having someone hurt me and then cutting off all ties and just putting on blinders and just being like, it doesn't affect me, it's not part of my life anymore, I'm moving forward and I'm better off without them. I thought that was pretty selfish for my future wife, my future kids, when they were wondering why they would look around and maybe some of the family didn't look like us, what those circumstances were. And I just didn't want to shrug it off and just be like, well, sometimes you get put into the foster care system and sometimes you get adopted, and that's just how life goes, end of story. But I knew that telling my story would kind of bring clarity on exactly what happened. And I didn't know what happened myself. I knew that I was put into foster care, I knew I was adopted, but aside from being abused and then my mom being on drugs, like, I really didn't know why. And I think as a society, we are very prone to play our role. And if you have the role of the victim and the role of the foster parent and the role of the social worker and the role of the police officer, every person is just set up to do their job and their job alone. And it's very rare that you'll have somebody that can step back and realize the perspective of somebody else, and they realize why they had a foster parent that was so focused on adopting them, or they had a social worker that was very gung-ho on kind of lightening their caseload, or you have a police officer that was just showing up to a routine call that was just like, hey, I'm just doing my job, please don't get upset with me. We really want to play our role, and we usually do that for the entirety of the rest of our lives. We don't see it from somebody else's perspective because their perspective doesn't affect us. So setting out on this project, I really wanted to gain perspective, because it's easy for me just to say, this parent wasn't fit, they would let me get into foster care, and they had to sign their rights away. That's the end of the story. But I mean, actually stepping back and then just being like, you know what, maybe I should hear him out. Because at the end of the day, like, we're just people, and people make mistakes. And if I am not open enough to hear somebody out for the circumstances that happened 20 plus years ago, then what kind of person am I if I'm going to be trying to advocate for change in the system, and if I can't change myself? So when I was in Texas, I knew that my mom was close, and this was only 4 years ago, and she told me that she had driven down from Tennessee, and I checked the distance from Austin, Texas to Memphis, and it was only about 8 hours. And being from Alaska, I knew that 8 hours is Anchorage to Fairbanks, and that's not too bad of a drive. So after 10 years, once I met her at 18, and then once I reached out again, then I was just kind of like, hey, I know we haven't talked a lot, but would you be willing to sit down and talk with me and kind of give me your perspective of what exactly happened? Just because I don't think she's ever actually chronologically laid everything out on how things went down. So I was able to meet up with her, and she was receptive, and we were able to talk, and a lot of healing was able to take place, and we were able to make progress. I knew that getting one person's perspective and another person's perspective would just turn into he said, she said, and then it kind of wouldn't tie everything together. That's why 2 summers ago, I petitioned the Alaska court system to release my file to me, because after you're adopted, it's usually a closed adoption, which means all the state records and everything that's been said about you gets sealed, stored away in archives, and then they eventually probably burn it in like 20 years. I was able to grab my file before it got destroyed, and that kind of that's the conduit to tie everything together. So I was able to track down my biological mother and get her side of things. I was able to petition the courts and get my folder released to me. It's like 800 pages of combing through documents and seeing what was said about me when I wasn't in the room, when I was in the room, during visitations, during the multiple foster parents that I had, and the homes that I moved through. So now that leads us to this point of 4 days out of just putting the last piece of this puzzle in. I'm not able to completely make a full project because I only have 2 out of 3 of the components. So it's kind of like putting together a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, and I'm missing 300 of the pieces, because getting the biological mother's standpoint was definitely eye-opening. Getting the state records definitely gave me a lot of clarity. But the one question that I get asked is, have you tracked down your biological father? And it's definitely been something that I've been putting off, because I have scars on my body from this person. So this isn't going to be a visit of, hey, I'm your son after 20 years, let's go have a beer. It's definitely a different visit. So I've never been excited about it. And as a person, I've never been scared of anything. Like I've dove in on the deep end without being a strong swimmer, and I've been around snakes and scorpions, and I've been around things, but I've never been had a phobia of anything. And it wasn't until this visit coming closer that I actually started to get scared and get anxious and get nervous. Just because I know the last time I saw this person, I was abused by them when I was 3 or 4 years old. So I spent my entire life just kind of putting that to the side of, it was something that happened, but I don't need to think about it, and I don't need to talk about it. I'm fine. I've graduated high school, I've graduated college, I've made lasting relationships, I have a great family, I have awesome friends, and I haven't felt that this is something that needs to happen in order to complete me. but I did feel like it was something that needed to happen in order to know the entirety of my story. So I tracked down, I looked in the state records to see if my biological father was still around. I didn't know if he left. I was able to run a background check a couple years ago when I was still in Texas, and that gave me about 7 addresses that he could have lived at, and 2 different phone numbers that were under his name. And that was originally the game plan, and I was gonna fly up to Alaska with a couple friends, and we're just gonna start knocking on doors and asking if this person used to live here. Knowing that my biological father was in the military, I knew that he had communications experience. So before this trip started, then I just kind of threw a Hail Mary, and I was just kind of put his name into Google, added communications in, added Alaska in, and he turned out to be the third request on the page, and I found out his place of work. And I never think that there's going to be a perfect time to come out of the woodwork and just say, I think I'm your biological son, let's talk. Especially if you're at work. But given the circumstances, it feels like that's kind of the only option I have. And this place is Monday through Friday, so 4 days from now, me and some good friends are going to fly into Anchorage, and we're going to go into his place of work and see if he is willing to talk to us and sit down. And just kind of, if there's ever a time to tell his side of things, this will be that time. And there's not going to be any police, there's not going to be anybody that's kind of, confront and put blame on anybody. It's just going to be, I'm here to listen, and I'm going to try to take as objectively as a seat as I can without being fully invested in it, because I could be very defensive and I could say, you hurt me, you abandoned me, you were supposed to be my dad, why did these things happen? But I think that forgiveness and understanding are kind of going to be that's going to get me the most out of the mileage on this one. And I forgave this person when I was 9 years old, and it was because it's a lot to deal with, of knowing that you had a biological father, you had a biological mother, you were in a family, and then you weren't the next day. And it's a lot to carry if you're just going to stay angry at the world, or you want to project your problems somewhere else.